Well, thank you, Wiley. Thank you for the honor of summarizing why this panel is excited to share with you some good news about turning the hydrocarbon industry's climate-altering methane emissions into profits. And we will not discuss ways to abate other important sources of methane emissions, but as you'll see, just this one is ample. While we strive to cut and stop fossil CO2 emissions, we can also turn down the global thermostat even faster by quickly abating super emitter emissions of hydrofluorocarbons, ozone, soot, or black carbon, and especially methane. And the left graph, starting with methane emissions shown in old ice core evidence, are now just standing up on end, magnifying that recent rise in the right-hand graph. Methane emissions have risen 2.5-fold, 60% of it through human activity, and they've caused 1/4 of global warming. Neglecting these as so-called trace gases, which implies they're minor, or arguing about 20 or 25 versus 100-year equivalences to CO2, creates a lot of confusion and obscures a vast opportunity. CO2 stays in the atmosphere for a long time, so we have to reduce its cumulative emissions, the stock in the air. While methane's effect is potent but brief, so we must reduce its rate of emissions, the flow into the air. These two metrics are not equivalent. It's as if you were atherosclerotic and needed better diet and exercise to reduce your long-term risk of heart attack and stroke, but meanwhile you also happen to be hemorrhaging from a cut artery. Do not waste time debating the equivalence between rate of plaque formation and rate of blood loss. Just stop the bleeding now so you'll survive to remedy your chronic conditions. Methane emissions are more analogous to arterial bleeding. They're a top priority in planetary first aid. Now, let's see. How do I get? So the potential leverage of methane emissions is prompt and it's large. Because methane lasts only about a decade in the atmosphere before it decomposes, even a small cut in its emissions, only 25 megatons a year or less, could rebalance the entire global methane cycle. And we don't need to stop there. We can overperform. Now, the global gas industry allows probably over 3% of its throughput to escape, and that estimate keeps rising as we expand the system boundary. Downstream methane leaks from old urban gas distribution pipes are important, but over 3 times as much methane escapes upstream, chiefly in oil and gas well sites. And about 20 to 40% of the upstream escape is from unintentional leaks, but the other roughly 60 or 80% is intentional. It's mainly from flares, like on the left, and engineered vents, like on the right, using a special infrared sensor. Flares can be up to 98% efficient if they're well designed and maintained and if the wind's not blowing. Otherwise, their efficiency drops to something like 90%. The other 10% enters the air unburned. Efficiency drops to 0 if the flare isn't lit, as sometimes happens if the operators think that nearby residents seeing a flame will complain. It happens. Industry veteran Wiley Rhodes will tell us how to turn all those losses into tens of billions of dollars of annual profits. And both as regulations tighten and to protect their reputations and social license to operate, issues that Alice Madden will discuss, many responsible oil and gas firms are cutting their own emissions. They've long done this to over 99.9% perfection for sour gas, whose hydrogen sulfide contaminant is more toxic than cyanogen, so it would otherwise kill people. But they're still in compliance mode, not quite grasping that emissions of sweet gas by anybody are also toxic to their business. But abating sweet gas emissions can often create profit. Here's a graph from the International Energy Agency's 27 Global Energy Outlook. And it shows that just the oil and gas industry's profitable global opportunity to abate methane emissions from their own flares and engineered vents, concentrated in just a few thousand places in under 10 nations, suffices to stabilize the global methane cycle. So this would be equivalent by 2100, if sustained, to cutting CO2 emissions by 160 gigatons. It's climatically equivalent in this century to instantly decarbonizing all homes in developed countries, or all coal-fired power plants in China, or half of all future automobiles. So it's a big deal. It's as if we opened this funny little closet on our runaway carbon train and discovered a handbrake. And it's not big enough to stop the train, but it can slow it down a lot, buying time to abate more CO2 emissions. And the firms that do this first will be heroes to their shareholders and to all of us. Their gain need not be confined to abating their own releases. One or more big hydrocarbon or service companies could roll up this profitable opportunity to abate everyone's deliberate emissions, mobilize the industry to raise the bar for everyone, overperform on mere compliance, exceed methane stabilizing abatements, and thus not just stabilize but start to reverse global climate change. Thanks.
Amory's knowledge and ability to present never ceases to amaze me. Before I hand this off to Alice, I think it's important to point out that Alice is currently running for the state senate in Colorado to replace yes, to replace
the program says I'm representing the law schools. I just want to be clear that I'm here as an individual, and I've taken a leave from the law school during this sojourn. So I met Wiley in 2015, and a friend of mine from Oklahoma said, you have to meet this old wildcatter from Wiley Roads who has this amazing technology. So we met, and I dragged him to AREDAY in 2015. He's, the rest is history. But I've learned so much from him about what is possible, and I'm a policy person. I'm not a substance expert like either of these folks. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about, Wiley has convinced me that there is a business case for capturing emissions, but we have seen it's not happening. So I'm going to do a little bit of compare and contrast what we saw with Obama, and I've worked in the Obama administration, and what Trump is doing now, and a little bit about the evolution of the rules in Colorado. So I'm going to start with the BLM and EPA emission rules. I thought the BLM rule in particular was really elegant. It basically said for all extraction on public lands, tribal lands, you don't have to capture these emissions, up to you, but if you don't capture them, you're going to have to pay royalties on what you emit. So it was the first time that we were requiring measurements. I want you to keep that in mind. The BLM rule required measurement of fugitive emissions. And Wiley will have a story a little bit later about why that is so important. So that's what I want you to take away from this. And this rule was immediately attacked as soon as Obama left office and Trump came in. It would have brought far more money in for royalties. You can see how much, even if we could capture 40% through the, I think the GAO analysis is actually a little bit under what I think someone like Wiley would say. It suggested under existing technology, you could capture 40%. I think Wiley could convince you could capture all of it under existing technology today. So that's another big takeaway. So I just want to point out this battle because, okay, there's a business case for doing this. They can make money doing it, but there's always a fight over any additional regulation. So you can kind of see the progression of the lawsuits. The takeaway here is that this rule is no longer in place. They were successful in basically repealing it. They went through a series of actions, some successful, some not. They tried to kill this through the Congressional Review Act. And if you know what this is, it's kind of like the nuclear option. If an administration can use the Congressional Review Act to get rid of a rule, that agency cannot write another rule having anything to do with that subject. It only had been used once before. And Trump tried to use it 15 times. So this is a radical move around trying to get rid of a past rule. And think about that. So you never have a rule on that entire topic again. Congress would have to have passed an act. So it shows the lengths to which industry is going to not have to measure. So here's a little bit of a response from someone from the Heritage Foundation, which is a little bit, I don't know, kind of amusing if it wasn't so depressing, that they're already doing everything that they can to capture everything because they can make money on it. So they're really saying our argument but they're basically saying they're doing this already and everything is possible, so why write a rule? But someone like Wiley can tell you that it's absolutely not happening, that there's far more being captured, and we know that, right? The infrared cameras prove that. This is just not a fact, but it's sort of the spin that's out there. So the EPA methane rule did not require measurement, and it's based on estimates. And I think this is really an important distinction. And the industry is not fighting this rule, and it is mostly still in effect. So again, it was only affecting new and modified oil and gas resources, not existing. That's important to know. There was a data collection process that was going to be part of this, and that was immediately stopped under the Trump administration. So you can see the estimated savings, the money that would have been brought in, but even for new and existing, 75% of methane from these infrastructure would remain unregulated. So again, Obama made many great steps forward, but it was just a start, and it wasn't enough. I think we all agree that it was a great start, but not enough. And now this has all been rolled back anyway. So again, another battle around this. This was not as successful. Ultimately, DC District Court overturned the Trump EPA's freeze of these standards, and most of that rule is still in effect. And the industry response is really different. You can see from some of these quotes that they are embracing the EPA measurement rule, and I think it's because it's estimates and not requiring data. So we do not right now have a requirement that you have to measure how much emissions are out there. And I just think that's an incredibly important distinction. The one amusing thing, again, and I try to find some humor in some of this, is that the woman from Shell mentioned that we're not in the business of telling government what to do, which I think is kind of funny. I spent a lot of money on lobbyists. So yeah, I did nothing against Shell, but it is kind of funny. So good, we'll take your word for that, and we'll try to move forward in the future. But you can see that I think it's also important that these people also see that their social license to operate is in the balance. So I try to take something good out of all this. So I want to tell you a little bit about Colorado, because it's been a fascinating journey, and I know a lot of you aren't from here, but we have a long, proud history of extraction in Colorado. Since 2007, I was in the legislature then with Governor Ritter. We started amending our oil and gas drilling rules. They had never been changed for years and years. The commission that oversaw the oil and gas drilling was actually all made up of industry members. So we slowly started changing that. In 2014, the rule that most people across the country has perhaps heard of is that for the first time ever, we wanted to directly control emissions of methane, reduce the fugitive emissions, start measuring, requiring follow-up. And again, the lobbying at that time, which was fascinating, by the industry was, we put in, someone put in the budget to have more inspectors. And the industry said, no, don't do that. Don't waste money on inspectors. We don't need more inspectors. So again, just a little bit of irony. Fast forward to this last election cycle in 2018. There was two things on the ballot. Proposition 112 was basically brought from a citizens group out of frustration about inaction, about how close oil and gas sites could be to their homes. And if you drive around suburban Denver area, you will see rigs everywhere. And it's been a huge impact on people, and people are worried about it. They're worried about their health, they're worried about their children's health. And you literally see them everywhere. And there's a lot of misinformation flying around. So they did a pretty dramatic 2,500-foot setback. It was defeated. The industry put together this Amendment 74 that was their response and kind of reaction, I think overreaction to 112. And it was basically, okay, go ahead and pass this, but we're going to make you pay for any foot that we can't drill on. You're going to have to still pay us for all the royalties, all the income that we're missing. It basically would have bankrupted every local government in Colorado. Something similar had been passed in a couple of other states, and their own legislatures repealed them because they realized how horrible it would have been. So this was a real strange bedfellows group of people who fought 74, and it was also defeated. At the same time, in 2018, it brought in the most progressive legislature we've ever seen in this state. And Governor Jerry Polis is now governor. So I'd say 2019 has probably been the most transformative legislative session in the history of the state, particularly around these issues. So Senate Bill 181 was introduced. It was passed. It's a sweeping measure around changing the mission of our Oil and Gas Commission from fostering, it literally said fostering oil and gas development, to more of a purpose of regulating it to prioritize health and safety. So it's a huge change. This is being done by rulemaking right now. If you're interested in it, it's ongoing right now about what these ultimate rules will look like. But these are the guidelines. One of the most important things it did too was create a lot more local control. There have been lawsuits over local control, what local governments can do in terms of where these things are, and those suits have been losing. So the statutes have been changed to allow local governments to have a bigger say. Also reform something called forced pooling about where you can actually, what mineral owners, you can force them to allow you on their land and extract from them. So it's an ongoing issue right now. I just wanted to make sure you're aware of it. Again, opposition response, at least $700,000 was spent on ads during the legislative session against the rule, telling people to call their legislators. This is going to end oil and gas drilling in the entire state. There's an ongoing recall attempt right now against Jared Polis. Petitions are out. So in Colorado, you can recall an elected person if you gather enough signatures and then send it to a special election. So that's happening right now. And not just on this bill, but there's also people upset about some gun legislation or a red flag bill that was passed. There's threatened ballot initiatives to undo it, and I don't think that they will be on the ballot, but those are just sort of the things we see. But at the same time, people, again, I mentioned they were so worried about this. The first witness to Senate Bill 181 was a survivor where her husband and brother were killed in her basement because an uncapped pipeline was located about 100 feet from their home, and their home exploded. Sent 4 people to the hospital, and her brother and boyfriend were killed. She was the first witness. It made a lot of news, obviously incredibly sad, and it put a lot of momentum around, again, more action around regulating oil and gas drilling. And at that same time, the newspapers were covering that our brown cloud, which is kind of infamous if you know anything about Denver, we sit a little bit in the valley, and it's back. And it affects people's health, and we have health warnings now. We're out of compliance. So that was the news that was going on in terms of what was going on. Just real quickly, Colorado likes to tout they have the most, the strongest regulations. Other states are, of course, taking action. California always leading the way on a number of these things. But even Utah is requiring more frequent leak detections than we are. And North Dakota has a statewide cap on flaring, which we don't have. So there's other states that are doing more, but there is forward motion. And I'll end with this. There's another bill that addresses climate change. Again, this is being addressed right now in rulemaking, but here are the goals. And I think this is a good start. And this is such a big change for Colorado. I just wanted you to be aware of what that actually means for their state. That, again, was basically our entire history has been around extraction, and now we have regulated this and changed the rules in a dramatic way.
Yeah, it's interesting to be a spectator in what's going on at a state level around the country. It's funny, I have a sore throat. I've been around the oil and gas industry my whole life, so maybe that's anyway. So, but Colorado is really on the cusp of having an opportunity to have a big impact worldwide on how oil and gas is operated, and I think it's really important. We'll talk about that more in just a minute, about what Colorado is doing, and for a state to have the political fortitude to actually do something and to implement it in a way that can have positive change, not just for the state, but it's an opportunity for us to demonstrate to the world that of what's possible. So they'll get my presentation up here shortly. So the work that we've done all began back in about 2014. My wife, unfortunately, was suffering from cancer, and she's since passed away. But in the beginning, we went and spent a lot of time up in Northern California. So being a West Texas guy up in Northern California, you can imagine I was a bit of a fish out of water. And telling people that I was in the oil and gas industry even magnified that problem. So I called my guys and I said, get this methane emissions deal. What's the big deal about it? Why in 2014 are we still having this discussion? Because they were able to convince me that everything can be equated to a mathematical equation of some type. And there's a way that it can be mitigated. There's a way that it can be managed. But there just never seemed to be anybody that was focused on it. And the oil and gas industry continued to take heat from the rest of the world in this methane emissions issue. So we began to work on it. We began to put some pieces together, and that is whenever I met Alice the first time. We were out in the Reno, Nevada area getting treatments, and she was kind enough to come out there and meet me. And we began the discussion, and that was whenever I was introduced to AREDAY and all the wonderful things that go on here. And in that is whenever I also met Amy Lovins. But I will, yeah, just go back to the first slide. Oh, am I clicking it?
Yeah, you're good.
Oh, man. That's how nervous I am. Go back for me, Alice. Thank you very much. Yeah, I was thinking, wow, that one's going. Yeah, I was thinking, why are they advancing that? So anyway, so we began to work on it and really focus on it. But an interesting event happened. So Chip was kind enough to invite me to Hawaii, and I was able to meet with Hank Rogers. And talking to him about what we were doing in oil and gas production and zero emissions, he began to describe to me what the definition of clean should be. Now, whenever we talk about the work that we're doing in oil and gas, it's important for you to understand that I understand what the definition of clean is. And the point is that just because it's the way we've always done it, doesn't mean that it has to represent the way we're always going to do it. And we've had an opportunity to work with Amory and all the team over at RMI, and Amory was kind enough to let me use the term the well site of the future. So this presentation will be the justification of how, if you could scrape it all off and start all over, how would you do it? And I think that's going to be an important part to connect the dots and what's been discussed the last couple of days and what we can do in the future. So what we're going to talk about real quick is the industry, the environment, the regulations. The regulations reduce, but innovation eliminates. And I think it's important that we have to remember that it is about all of us and to be proactive in this and to look at the horizon of what can be done if we put some creative energy into it. And then implementing the technologies that will not only measure the volumes of gas that are being emitted, but to also implement a mass balance so that everything that comes out of the ground is measured all the way through the system to be sure that it's accounted for. And the crazy thing is that in the oil and gas industry, that's not being done. So faulty reasoning leads to faulty designs. So the emissions are assumed to be methane, first of all. It's important to understand that whenever you look at the value of the hydrocarbon chain all the way through, methane is actually the least valuable, and I didn't push it that way. Methane is the least valuable hydrocarbon in the whole hydrocarbon chain. As you go down and you have ethane, propane, butane, and all the other hydrocarbons all the way down to oil, they become more valuable at every step in monetary, and the reason they're more valuable is because they have a higher heating value. So all the mitigating methane emissions has always been just that. The value of all these other hydrocarbons were never taken into consideration, and therein lies the solution.
Value meaning economic value.
That's right, yeah. The economic value to justify the cost of the infrastructure to capture those hydrocarbons. So the emissions defined. So Baruska had mentioned a topic to me this morning, and that's about fugitive emissions from wells. So there's leaks. And by definition, fugitive emissions are just that. It's a leak. It's an accident. It doesn't happen by design. The biggest problem, and Amory mentioned it briefly, is process emissions. So these are engineered releases that he mentioned, and it's important to know that these are by design. So the emissions that are shown there to the right of that are the same ones that Amory used earlier. The one on the left is just to the naked eye. So unfortunately, you can't see hydrocarbon emissions that are being vaporized out of the tank. You have to, I don't know why it's doing that, maybe it's this. So you have to have an infrared camera in order to see it. So it's hard to hold people, companies, and countries specifically accountable. We do a lot of work in West Africa, and we were flying in a helicopter over the Delta, and one of the representatives from the government was like, well, there's very few flares. It shouldn't be a problem, just eliminating these few. And my point to him was, they don't light them. Because if they light the flares, then it draws attention to them, and that attention is where the fine is derived. So there are penalties in Nigeria, for instance, for flaring the hydrocarbons. But if they don't know it's being flared, then they assume that they get by without paying it. So these are all things to be mindful of as we go through this and start justifying and understanding the difference between fugitive emissions, accident, processing, or engineered emissions which are designed. So this is a temporary standard well design. You can see you have the storage tanks, the water tanks up on the upper right-hand corner. And then down in the lower left-hand corner, you have the separation equipment and the wellheads. So then you see the sales delivery point right there. Okay, so all the things that happen in all those components, all the way through that system, are not measured. Nothing is measured in the standard design that's being done all over the world right now is just done at the sales point. So in other words, at custody transfer point. So what we want to be sure that we do is to understand you can't manage what you don't measure. If it's never been measured, how can all the reports that are circulated around the world on methane emissions and hydrocarbon emissions, what is it based on? I saw a report that in 2017, the state of Colorado was able to lower the methane emissions. Well, based on what? What was the starting point? It was a number that was derived the year before that didn't represent anything, except an estimate and rules of thumb. And as Amy told me whenever we were talking about that, we're not building better thumbs. So we took this image out of the EPA training manual for emissions. Okay, so in that training manual, measure is not used one time, not even once. Estimate is used 37 times. Okay. So it's important to understand that all the great work that the EPA does, and it's not to point fingers at them, they're doing everything that they can. But the point is that all the things that are being circulated and all the information that's being circulated only represent estimates and rules of thumb. So the existing meter locations are the squares in red. So you can see after the glycol dehydrator up to the gas pipeline, that's one point. That's a custody transfer point. But if you look upstream of all those, you see all these places where it shows that all those things are emitting hydrocarbons. Same thing on the water tank, and then the same thing on the oil. So it's important to understand that none of those things are being accounted for because they're not required to. So whenever a company, an oil and gas production company, reports their production volumes and their emissions, it's all based on a calculation that was developed in the 90s whenever the EPA began to put these regulations in place. So to optimize the design, again, it's to go back and start all over and to take what is existing. So in other words, to go back all the way to the wellhead. An interesting thing happens whenever oil and gas is produced. So the interesting thing is that downhole under a lot of pressure, it's all what's called the dense phase. So I had to have it explained to me the first time I heard it. So the dense phase is whenever the gas and the light molecules are dissolved in the heavier molecules. So the way that hydrocarbons interact with each other, the lighter hydrocarbons dissolve into the heavier hydrocarbons as the pressure increases. As the pressure decreases, the reverse happens. So the lighter hydrocarbons flash off, and the heavier hydrocarbons remain liquid, but as the pressure continues to lower, the more vaporization you have. So if you have an inlet separator that comes from the wellhead, and you only have one stage of separation, let's say it's at 500 psi. So you separate the oil and the gas at 500. The oil goes to the tank, and so the pressure or the vaporization from 500 psi all the way to atmosphere flashes off. So imagine opening a Coke on a hot day that you just shook up and magnifying that by 10 times. Because the Coke is stored at about 50 psi. So if it's at 500 psi, the volatility of that reaction is enormous. And that's why you see those hydrocarbons flashing off the tanks. So my deal is defining a super emitter is nothing more than defining leak. You won't see a super emitter emitting fugitive emissions other than what happened at Aliso Canyon. Fugitive emissions are relatively small. Now, collectively, worldwide, it doesn't count for a large volume of hydrocarbons, but most of those, again, are the super emissions that happen in the reaction that I just described. So what you do is you can take, and at the first phase of separation, take that liquid hydrocarbon stream and begin to break it down. So instead of having one phase of separation, or even 4 phases, which a lot of companies in Colorado are doing, to try to mitigate the vaporization of those hydrocarbons, the technology that we developed in New Point has 32 phases of separation. So what you do is, under pressure and under heat, you simulate the separation of these hydrocarbons so you can make sure and cut it off. So everything that goes over to the tank that is stored in the atmosphere is stabilized to the point that nothing is vaporized off. Everything that goes into the gas stream is nothing more can go into the gas than won't liquefy in advance of it entering the pipeline. All the intermediate hydrocarbons in that hydrocarbon chain, from propane and butane all the way down to the hexanes, just at the point of it becomes stabilized in the atmosphere, all those hydrocarbons are called natural gas liquids. We published a paper a couple of years ago that's called Natural Gas Liquids, the Orphan Hydrocarbon, because there's no home for them in virtually any infrastructure around the world. And it's important to point out that all the hydrocarbons in the world are produced in this manner. There's no place, there's no unique place. I was asked about this the first time in West Africa. And they said, well, what do you do in the US? And I'm like, well, we just do better. You know, I'm not sure exactly what we do. Whenever I came back, I became mindful of this. What do we do with all these intermediate hydrocarbons? And that's when I discovered that we don't do anything. The industry, and I'm a part of the oil and gas industry, and I'm very grateful for the life that I've been able to live. But at the end of the day, we pay a shell and pea game with these hydrocarbons, and well, they come out here, and now we moved it from over there to over here. And you know, for an EPA regulator, there's a whole lot to keep up with. And now you can burn it, but while that does reduce methane emissions, it sure doesn't do anything to reduce the CO2 emissions. So what we're proposing is just that. So if you look at this, you still have the wellhead and the separators on the left. And you see, all you have on the right is the water storage tanks. So the green equipment represents, I'm really not doing that. The green equipment and the red compressor there represent how we handle these intermediate hydrocarbons. So what we do is we take them in those 2 towers in that gray unit. That's where we create the 32 phases of separation. So the oil is dumped out of the inlet separator. The separator dumps to the first phase of the CFU, or the stabilizer, and there we flash off the methane. We want to flash off all the hydrocarbons that will go into the pipeline and stay into the gas pipeline. And so the little red compressor there is used to compress that flash gas into the pipeline. The liquid comes out of the first tower and goes into the second tower, and in that tower is where we stabilize oil. So whatever the specification is, there's a lot of areas that you'll have an 8 RVP specification for oil, in some places it's even up to 12. So what our system does is we stabilize the oil to that point, and then everything in between is what goes into that green pump and those green storage tanks. Because in order to eliminate the vapors, it has to be stored under pressure. If it's not under pressure, it's going to vaporize and flash off and become gasoline. So the immediate impact is to... All right. The immediate impact is to eliminate emissions. So whenever we're talking about climate change and how all these things are managed, to have an understanding of how these hydrocarbons interact with each other and understanding the definition of clean. Clean is zero. So you have to go back and all the way back to where the oil comes out of the ground and all the connections that are connected in between and carry that all the way through the process, all the way through the transportation system, and then all the way to the point of consumption. So our new point zero emissions well site of the future is something that's an ongoing process. What New Point has done is focused on the production of oil and gas and how these intermediate hydrocarbons flash off. But RMI and some other work that we all are doing together is, again, from the drilling, the design of a wellhead, the design of a separator to get back to Baruch's point. But what about these leaks? You know, the consensus is in the environmental community is that every well will leak at some point. Well, you have to design it where you don't have the connections that do leak. And so those are the things that we can begin to implement and integrate into the oil and gas world and demonstrate that all of these things can be done at a profit. These are the things we've done now. They're available to the market, and we've done it in the past. But nobody wants to look at it from a eliminating hydrocarbon emissions standpoint. And that's a very unfortunate situation that we find ourselves in. So that's the end of my presentation, and after that I'm sure that myself and Amory and Alice would be glad to answer any questions. But I think it's important to point out that we are also working on creating a blue hydrogen source. That's going to be important to utilize these hydrocarbons to create a source for hydrogen that can be utilized to generate power to fuel cars, but it's done from a zero emissions fuel source, and it's done that the carbon is sequestered. So, Amy,
well, Wally, Alice said you were going to tell us a story about how big the emissions actually are.
Oh, okay. So Burlington.
What measurement?
Yes.
Okay.
Burlington Resources in Texas several years ago found themselves in a bit of a pickle. So what happened was this old German farmer, they were wanting to drill a well on his place, and you know, he didn't need the money, so he really haggled with him. He told him that in order for you to drill on my property, you've got to pay me on everything that you produce. So if you flare anything, you've got to pay me on that too. And they agreed. So in order to pay him on it, they had to measure it. Whenever you file a permit to drill a well in Texas, you have to file it through the Texas Railroad Commission. So the Texas Railroad Commission allows you 50 standard cubic feet per day of emissions, and that's what they call a standard exemption. So they drill the well, they get it up, it's a good well, and they start producing it. So they're measuring all these things to pay the farmer. And the farmer realized that he's getting 5,000. It's over 5 million standard cubic feet per month, not 1,500. So they were out of compliance with the Railroad Commission.
You're saying they're emitting 100 times as much as the assumption?
Yes, that's right. See, everybody just assumed that.
And that's
this
the
was
one
what's
data
going on.
point we have.
Yeah.
And all of that, and I've shared that with AREI and Alice, that's all public information. You can go to the Texas Railroad Commission and it's all there because it was court proceedings that were enacted. And so the solution was long drawn out deal. Burlington paid a fine and said, we'll never measure again. So there you go. And so that's how we got to the one data point that we have that's in the public domain that demonstrates the point that we're making. It's a lot bigger than people think it is. As a matter of fact, our estimates are, based on all the work that we've done around the world, is that there's 308 standard cubic feet of gas emitted for every barrel of oil produced around the world. 308. Whenever you multiply that out, I mean, it's a staggering number, and it's not all methane. So our point is that it's all feasible to capture.
But it's all value.
That's right.
Another thing I learned from Wiley is, we focus on methane, because that's literally the shiny thing in the sky, right, flaring. But the other hydrocarbons are incredibly important to account for. And if you took anything away from my presentation, it's about the importance of measurement and having to require that in a rule. And that's the thing that's been fought the most. And we've heard from the industry that when people complain about smells, they're like, well, methane doesn't smell, so that's just some psychosomatic reaction they're having. It's these heavy molecules that are leaking that they're smelling. And we don't talk about that enough, and it's something I think all of us have to, instead of just saying methane, I think we have to talk about all the emissions.
So do you think Colorado will end up requiring full measurement?
It looks like that could definitely happen. I think that's...
Because then we would have more than one data point.
Just a few more, yeah. So the rulemaking is going on now, as I mentioned before. So for those of you from here who want to get engaged, I'm happy to talk more about that.
And I think it's important that we acknowledge the work that Alice has done in the past and how mindful she is of this emissions and oil and gas production in Colorado to work to replace Fort Gardner.
I want to be careful, not too much politics, but I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, I thought that's what you were doing.
No,
So, but it's important to me because in order for this work to be implemented, somebody has to stand up and actually do something. And there's not been a political will any place other than Colorado. And I think, Amy, you're doing some work in RMI to implement measurement on that.
Yeah, we're hoping to pull together a very interesting group of players to actually design and I hope build a well-site future.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.